Thank you, Chair. I have some questions for Mr. Reid. I do want to ask some questions about the situation with schools, but before I do, I'm going to ask some questions about quarantine. The European Commissioner travelled to this state from a non-green list country. He has justified breaking the 14-day quarantine on the grounds of having had a negative COVID test. Now, I think the answer to this question is probably fairly obvious, but I think it's important that we hear it from the Chief of the HSE. So the question is, did he break HSE guidelines by doing so?
Deputy, I'll just come back very briefly, and I'd ask my colleague Dr. Colm Henry just on the specific guidelines, just to say, obviously as a public servant, I'm not going to encroach into the area of any kind of political comment. What I will say is our guidelines and guidance are very clear, both on the HSE site, and indeed there's more in-depth guidance on the HPSC site, and that would be the go-to site in terms of information, both in terms of travel and both in terms of testing or testing negative, and it's very clear on the site. So I might just ask Dr. Colm Henry to clarify it.
Thank you, Deputy. The advice from HPSC is clear in this regard that people coming to Ireland from non-green list countries restrict their movements for 14 days, and that's irrespective of tests that's performed either abroad or here. Okay,
and then my other point on that, before I get to my main points on the schools, the Irish Times this morning reports comments this morning from two women who were in the K Club between.
I think we need, the Cairns judgment is very clear that we have to stay within our terms of reference, and I don't think that that this comes within our terms of reference. That's my view. I'm happy to come back to this point. The HSE will be in before us again. We can take a legal opinion on this. But as a chairman of this committee, Deputy Barry, I'm tasked with keeping us within the terms of reference, and I intend to try to do that.
So let me put it this way. If someone were to be staying in a complex, a hotel complex with apartments, within the time frame of a 14-day quarantine, and they were to stay in that complex, but to dine in a public restaurant and other public places within that complex, would that constitute a breach of the 14-day quarantine?
I don't really think it's fair to say that we're talking in generalities here, because we're not, from their first question. And I return to, I'm happy to, if this is within our terms of reference, I'm happy to have it discussed. But I am very keen that we remain within our terms of reference, Deputy Barry.
Chair, I would like an answer to the question. I'm not naming any individual. I'm saying that if someone were to be within a hotel complex or an apartment within a 14-day quarantine.
You're asking this question in the context of a political controversy that's ongoing. It is.
Just say all of our guidance is on our site. Happy to circulate it again to committee, but it's very clear on the site.
Where it is on the site, because I mean, I at one point went to find it, and I found it remarkably difficult to find the guidance. I'm not suggesting for a moment it's not on your site, but where is, because the guidance does change as the medical advice changes in response to what is a changing scenario. Where is it available on the HSE website?
It's readily available.
And I'm conscious of the fact that Deputy Barry has 2 minutes left. Sorry. Maybe I'll come back to that. I'll give Deputy Barry, let him finish his time.
Okay. On the 6-1 news last night, there was a news item about back to school which featured a school in County Carlow. It showed an assembly where I think prayers were being conducted, with more than 150 students spaced about 1 metre apart. Would you be prepared to comment on that situation, not with regard to that specific school, but in a general sense? Do you think it is best practice not to have assemblies of that type?
Yeah, I think, again, Deputy, I won't comment on that particular one because I've only heard the news report. That's all I've heard on it. But I think just the guidance just to schools, and in fairness to the Department of Education and the school principals, they're working through very difficult situations, and the absolute guidance is, as they've repeated themselves and the Minister last night, is to aim for 2 metre distance throughout the whole school settings. And what I've seen so far is a really strong engagement by principals and schools to implement that. Obviously, it's very challenging in some schools versus others, but our guidance would be to avoid mass gatherings where possible. Absolutely.
Okay, and then finally, The new president of the ASTI went public the other day and said that there was an issue which she described as an issue of life or death for some of her members, people who are categorised according to the guidelines as high risk, including people who have had cancer, heart conditions, diabetes and so on, being denied the right to work from home and being asked to report for duty in the schools. One such teacher, who was affected by acute leukemia, type 2 diabetes, asthma, anemia and an autoimmune disorder, said, "I feel like a turkey waiting for Christmas." Should teachers who have high risk as opposed to very high risk be forced to report for duty in the schools as opposed to being allowed work from home?
Again, Deputy, what I say is, I know you're quoting some generalities. Again, our public health guidance is very clear in terms of the approach for vulnerable groups, etc. That's a guidance that all work organisations would have available to them, obviously including schools. So I can't comment on a specific case in terms of a particular teacher or particular vulnerability that they may have had. That's an issue for all work organisations to implement as per our guidelines.